So welcome to our Teaching English webinar for teacher educators. My name is Shirin Soyaz and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all so much for joining this live event. This session, we have two guest speakers, Ursula Lanvers and Tetyana Lunyova. And we will be exploring decolonizing English language teaching through research insights from Ukraine. As usual, before we start our session, I'd like to share a number of quick housekeeping reminders with you. So please share with us in the Q&A where you are from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in service, type in-service in the Q&A. So this session is being recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be available on our Teaching English website in the next couple of days. And the link to the certificate also will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive tomorrow. And finally, you'll have a chance to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A to ask our presenters your questions. We will be using the chat for announcements. So let me introduce our presenters today. Ursula Lanvers is a professor of Applied Linguistics, and Ursula is a social linguist with a special interest in language policy, language education, and learner motivation. And Tetyana Lunyova is a researcher at Risk Fellow at the University of York. Tetyana is an educator and a linguist interested in semantic and pragmatic dimensions of meaning making in educational, societal, and aesthetic context. So it's we'd like to invite Ursula and Tetyana. Hello.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting us.
I'm going to share the slides now. I hope you can all see the slides, and thank you for inviting us today, and thank you also for your very interesting comments on the pre-seminar task today. I hope we will get an opportunity later today to come back to some of these comments. So very briefly, what we were hoping to do today is to talk about the project that we have in Ukraine. Okay, we call it DEEP, which is an acronym for Decolonizing Teaching English Pedagogy, a teacher training program. So in the first bit, I will talk a little bit about what we do and why we do it. This is just the two of us today, Tetyana and myself, but we are a team. And I would like to stress that this is a team effort. So here you can see the 5 people involved in this project, based in the Ukraine or representing the University of Poltava, Marina Tsuyenko and Tetyana Lunyova. We could not do this project without them because they are the ones providing us with the local insight and the knowledge about what teachers actually do and what they need currently. So together we developed this project, which is delivering teacher training. And in this brief seminar, what we want to do is the following. First of all, I will talk a little bit about what decolonizing the teaching of English actually means and introduce a couple of key concepts. Then Tetyana will talk about the context in Ukraine, why this is so important to focus on decolonizing the teaching of English in Ukraine and what the challenges are. Then together we will present our project, how we designed the study and the aims, and Tetyana will produce a couple of examples of the actual materials that we used. And after that, I will summarize by saying where we are and what we're going to do next. And throughout this, we will have 3 opinion polls where you are invited to give your opinion by clicking on a simple yes/no poll. So don't be shy and participate. Thank you. So as said, we want to start with talking about what decolonizing the teaching of English actually means. The first thing it means is to acknowledge that English and the position that English has in the world today is a result of a history of colonialism. And that's an important thing to acknowledge. Historically, we had a migration of speakers of English to North America, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And those speakers of English, mostly monolingual speakers of English, brought with them their language, English, and forced people to acquire it. Okay, so this large-scale acquisition of English came about as a result of colonial exploits and trade, and resulted in widespread bilingualism. Decolonizing teaching English also means that we understand the difference between the spread of English historically and the spread of English today. I talked about the historic past, really. People movement, including the movement, first of all, of people from Britain to the colonized areas, and then movement back through the transportation, for instance, of slaves, and also the transportation of goods. So it was very material, linked to material movement. Today's movement of English and the spread of the English language is facilitated completely differently. It is really focusing on the movement of information through the media, including social media, of course, education systems, and it is also facilitating the spread of a large variety of English. And the physical movement of people, for instance, has taken a very different dimension, including more or less free movement, or much freer. So really what we have seen since the second half of the 20th century, an increasing importance of using English as a lingua franca, as an international language. And I'm quoting just a little bit here from David Grataul, who was one of the first people to write about this phenomenon. We have seen speaker migration since the 1960s, for instance, and 2000, about 3%, which is a high percent of the global population who are migrating. And this form of migration is one of the large contributors of the spread of English today. This kind of spread really links to urban centers. So urban centers, large cities rather than the countryside, are very often the foci of multilingualism, linguistic contact, and therefore also language change and language diversity. Increasingly now, as a result of these movements, what we see is encounters between people who speak English, both of whom are non-native speakers of English. It is estimated that, perhaps as a very conservative estimate, for 3/4, so 75% of all communications in English are taking place between two non-native speakers of English. An example for that would be the tourist trade, where English is used as a lingua franca. Related to this, and not as a result of the English language, no language in itself is intrinsically more or less just than any other language, but as a result of unequal distributions of access to wealth and access to education, we have a number of social injustices that relate to the use and the learning of English. We still have English varieties that belong to the former colonizers that carry higher prestige than of those people who were colonized. We still have a preference for those people, varieties, who learned English as a first language. In particular, in education systems, those two varieties are UK and US varieties. And we have today, as a result of all of this, a very unequal access to the learning of English. So unequal in terms of different countries, depending on how wealthy countries are and how good education systems are. And within one country, how wealthy particular families might be and whether they can afford to send their child to a better school. None of this is related to intrinsically the nature of the English language. But what we have as a result of this historic development is a perception in the global South that the learning of English can be a way out of poverty. In itself, this can be plausible and can be successful, but this promise comes with its own problems because we don't know necessarily if this is always the case and if it's English teaching or teaching via the English language is always to the benefit, including economic benefit of the learners. We have studies from UNESCO that show us that it may not be so. It is intrinsically very difficult to prove because in an ideal study design, you would have some students in the same context with the same backgrounds. Some of them are studying via English and some of them are studying via their home language, and then compare not only the learning outcome, but also the economic and professional outcomes of these learners. This kind of research would be unethical and quite impossible to do. So this remains a bone of contention altogether. What I've there done is to paint a picture of why and how English became what it is today, the most important, by far the most important lingua franca that the world has seen globally. And this has implications for how we should teach English. And therefore, I've written down a couple of key principles of teaching English in a decolonized manner. Number one, we should value all varieties of English, not just native speaker varieties. And when we are teaching English, we should really focus on the one form of English that is used by the students, local, regional, and national varieties, and move away from the target of teaching either UK or US standards. The focus should be overall on preparing our young learners for the kind of English use that they are likely to encounter once they're out of the classroom. It reminds me of an important quotation from Claire Crumph, who said, "At no time in the history of language teaching have we seen a starker discrepancy between what happens in classrooms and what the learners ultimately need later in life outside the classrooms. What they need is the ability to communicate with people who are using English with all sorts of different first languages, with all sorts of accents, with all sorts of cultural differences. In other words, mutual intelligibility is what we should be aiming for. And that means when we're using materials, when we are forming our assessments, etc., we should also try to use other varieties than those native speaker varieties. And it also means that we should value the languages that students have in the classroom. The ultimate aim for language teaching is not necessarily their first language plus English. It is to value multilingual skills in total. And the multilingual skills should be permitted in the classroom. We now have sufficient pedagogical insights to know that a multilingual approach to teaching languages is beneficial. And last but by no means least, we know that language and culture are intertwined. When we are teaching English, what we would like to do is focus not so much on the teaching of English culture, British culture, or American culture, but foster students' awareness of intercultural differences so that students are prepared for future communications with people from all sorts of cultural backgrounds, to know where their cultural sensitivities lie, to know how to say something without offending somebody from all sorts of very different cultural backgrounds. So that's me explaining the context and explaining where we're coming from when we prepared our materials. So we now have a poll, and this poll is about Robert Phillipson, the key person who is skeptical about the spread of English today, who said, what do we think about the spread of English? Maybe the English language spread today is just a new form of imperialism, and he called it linguistic imperialism. And I'm simply asking you, do you agree, yes or no? Feel free to vote now. It will be very, very interesting to see the results. Okay. Aha. Thank you very much for your comments. So I can see that the results are overwhelmingly yes. Okay. So we can see that there is a critical opinion amongst us all together. So that's been very, very useful. Already we have basically laid the first foundation for a critical awareness towards teaching English. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we are talking about our project. We are introducing you to what we are doing with our teachers in Ukraine. First of all, I'll just explain the context a little bit. Oh no, I will hand over to my colleague Tetyana, who can do this much better.
Thank you very much, Ursula. And let me first of all introduce the context of our project, which has this double focus on promoting teacher continuing professional development in Ukraine and also doing research into the challenges and opportunities of fostering decolonized teaching of English. So Ukraine is an independent Central European country. And let us start of looking what is the place of English in education in Ukraine. So English is taught as a foreign language in Ukraine. And if you would like to conceptualize that, you might think in terms of famous Kucherus model of concentric circles. So Ukraine belongs to the expanding circle. English is compulsory subject in school, which means all children take it, and education is free of charge in Ukraine. So every child has an opportunity to learn English. Teaching English starts in the first grade in the primary school, and primary schooling in Ukraine begins when children reach the age of 6. Typically, and teaching English continues through all the secondary education, which is now 11 years of study. But Ukraine launched a reform into its system of secondary education, and the pupils who started their secondary school in 2018 and all the consecutive years, they will be going to school for 12 years now. So 12 years of learning English in school. The main language of education in Ukraine is Ukrainian, which is the state language, the official language. The legislation also stipulates that it is possible to teach a range of subjects in English or in other languages, and it does happen in practice. For example, the methodology of CLIL, content and language integrated learning, has been introduced, and quite a few teachers in Ukraine now have taken the training in this CLIL methodology, and they are trying it in their own schools. However, it's not a common practice yet. However, we can say that these are rather these pockets of introducing these innovations rather than a common practice in Ukraine. And we do have minority speakers in Ukraine, and the law guarantees them an opportunity to learn their native language, the minority language, and also to be educated via their language, via the minority language. In order to fully appreciate, yes, thank you very much. In order to fully appreciate the complexities of the context and the peculiarities of the Ukrainian context, it is important to have a wider look at the relationships between the key languages in Ukraine, which are Ukrainian, Russian, and English. If you have a brief glimpse into the history of Ukraine, we can see that Ukraine has been the place for contestation for linguistic rights for a long period of time. Tsarist Russia, which is the 18th, 19th centuries, had a very consistent policy of not letting Ukrainian its full development. So Ukrainian was very much restricted in the domains where it could be used. It might be sufficient just to mention one of the laws of Tsarist Russia, which was so-called Valuyev Circular, Valuyev being the first name of the minister of relations of Russia. And by that circular, it was proclaimed that no so-called Little Russian language ever existed, exists, or will exist. You can see this law did not even give the full name to Ukrainian. It just called it by Little Russian rather than Ukrainian. So there was no education via Ukrainian. The publication of books in Ukrainian was prohibited. Also, the import of books published in Ukrainian somewhere else was also prohibited to the Tsarist Russia. During the Soviet times, which start from 1917, there was a very brief period when Ukrainian was allowed to develop, and that was a period when the Soviet government expected to gain a wider support on the side of Ukraine. But very, very shortly, in early 1930s, the policy came back to resemble the policy of Tsarist Russia, and Ukrainian was strongly limited in the domain. So basically, it was limited just to being spoken in the everyday conversations. So the education, if you think about education, the higher education in Ukraine during the Soviet times was done via the Russian language. The majority of schools in Ukraine during the Soviet times provided teaching in Russian. Much fewer schools offered teaching in Ukrainian, and when they did it, still there was a lot of room for the Russian language and the Russian literature to be taught to Ukrainian children. Moreover, parents in Ukraine would opt their children out of learning Ukrainian altogether. And besides, Ukrainian was restricted in many other domains, like the publication of fiction in Ukrainian was tolerated, but publication in Russian was widely supported. The same holds true for translations into Russian or Ukrainian from foreign languages. Ukrainian kind of barely tolerated, translations into Russians widely supported, widely circulated. Attempts to revalidate Ukrainian were done before Ukraine officially proclaimed its independence. And it was 1989 when the law adopted in Ukraine proclaimed that Ukrainian should be the state language. And basically that law, that proclamation, is believed to be the prelude to Ukrainian independence, the first paving stone for Ukraine gaining its full independence, which happened in 1991. Since then, the policy to introduce, to support Ukrainian has been consistent. Ukrainian was being returned to school, to higher education, publications, translations were supported via the policy. Very drastic changes happened since February 2022 when Russia launched full-scale war against Ukraine. And that really marked a change in the attitude of the population. So there has been quite a lot of surveys which demonstrate the grassroots initiatives of switching to Ukrainian over Russian, both in everyday conversations and at the workplace. A lot of institutions, universities, public libraries started offering free Ukrainian language courses, which have become very popular and are still attended by many speakers. There have been other aspects of just bottom-up resistance towards the Russian. For example, the word Russia in Ukrainian started to be spelled with the small letter consistently, a kind of the small act of resistance. Or one of the unique letters of Ukrainian alphabet, the letter Y, which looks like English I, but with two dots above it, has become the symbol of resistance, and in the occupied cities like Mariupol, it was painted over and over to remind of the Ukrainian language and the Ukrainian independence. In this context, English has acquired also a new lens, a new color, a new perception, and English is now welcomed as a means and as both as a practical means and as a symbolic means of demonstrating that Ukraine would like to align itself with Europe and with the Western world, and English is very much welcomed instead of Russian as a lingua franca. So we move on to the, I think we need the previous slide. Yeah, we move on to the challenges of, you can probably come to these conclusions by yourself from my brief introduction, but just briefly would like to highlight some of the challenges. So far, there has been very strong awareness of the Russian colonial past, and have been very, very strong attempts to get rid of Russian colonial past, including changing the geographical names in Ukraine, which bear and represent the history of Russia, and replacing them with either traditional Ukrainian names or new Ukrainian names. However, on the other hand, there is much less awareness of the colonized history of teaching English, and potentially bringing new colonizing pedagogy via teaching English if we do not approach teaching English in a critical and reflective way. For example, there is a clash between strivings to promote further development of Ukrainian and aspirations to welcome English more and more into more spheres of the Ukrainian life. So, for example, while English is welcomed as a language of academic publications, and Ukrainian academics are encouraged to publish more on English, there are fears that the more published in English, the less in Ukrainian, and that this practice can actually be counterproductive to promoting the development of academic Ukrainians. Ukrainian teaching still is quite largely oriented towards native speaker norms, these ones being predominantly the norms of the British speakers, the ideal of the received pronunciation, but also the norms of the USA, the general American. The education does have its constraints. There is a national curriculum, and there are high-stake tests which students take after leaving the school. Students take in order to continue their education, in order to progress from the bachelor to master degree. And these educational constraints actually provide a certain perspective into English. In particular, they value the native speakers' norms, and they also provide kind of very simplified understanding between the connection of language and culture, linking English language unproblematically just to the British or the American culture. And the third important aspect of these constraints is actually putting high emphasis upon accuracy rather than on the skills of accommodation and being able to negotiate meaning with very, very different speakers. So, in sum,
before we move on, yes, we have received so many questions. So if you like, we can pause for a second and reflect on them, because there are really very nice comments. Firstly, thank you so much for providing this background in knowledge for us. And thank you, our participants. So it's great to see participants from all around the world, from South Africa to Asia. And this diversity also shows how English is used differently around the world, which connects directly to our topic. And so just to briefly mention a few comments, you mentioned the impact of migration movements, and we also have a pre-webinar comment that connects to this. One of our participants mentioned, I believe the main implication is going beyond the inner circle varieties of English and trying to develop our students' awareness of the global language situation and their intercultural competence. And our participants also commented, I don't know if there are any particular comments that you would like to highlight. Huma, for example, mentioned that about ELT policies. So linguistically and culturally, decolonizing to me means having the pedagogical freedom to teach English in a manner that fits the context. So if there are any other comments that you would like to comment on, if not, we have some questions from Jafet, for example. How can educators integrate culturally responsive teaching practices into English language instruction while challenging the dominance of Eurocentric perspectives? Do you have any comments about this?
Yeah, so they are precisely the heart of the questions, and it is one of these things that we are gradually, bit by bit, trying to address by offering teachers new insights into how English is used. And in the next section, when we are presenting the material that we gave to our teachers as teacher training materials, we are showing how this can actually be done. But we also understand that this is a process of changing perceptions of what is a good standard, of what are good teaching materials, and what are ultimate learning aims for our students. And these are very deeply ingrained beliefs that are very often shared between teachers and parents and education systems and also future employers. None of this is going to happen overnight. But what we are hoping to do is to demonstrate that if you are showing a wider awareness of how English is used as a lingua franca today, by showing a variety of examples and making teachers aware of a variety of decolonized teaching materials, that this approach can be taken on more easily. But we are under no illusion that there is a kind of quick fix method or a one method fits all. This is a slow burner.
So we need to, we also had some sessions on translanguaging, and Manise also asking, can translanguage enhance English decolonization?
Yes, because translanguaging really means that we value the students' languages that they come with. And very often, the languages that they enter the classroom with are not the ones that carry high prestige in the education systems. And so we want to address that. And we want to facilitate metalinguistic awareness by doing things like comparative linguistics, which is so cognitively enriching for our learners and really, really helps the learning of English and helps the learning of other languages as well.
Yeah, exactly. Just if you let me briefly to jump in, what we are trying to do by this, we are trying to demonstrate that there are multiple perspectives which can be expressed via English, and that we would like our participants of our program to be exposed to this multiplicity of perspectives. For example, we introduce the writers who write in English, but from Africa, for example, who make this aware, and we demonstrate how these writers were able to appropriate English so that it could express their very, very different perspectives and their very, very different life experiences. And then you're absolutely right that there is a natural bridge to translanguaging, because this is which indeed it does happen in the Ukrainian classroom, but sometimes it may be getting an unduly criticism. Our point is, first of all, to acknowledge this practice, to enable our teachers to see the advantages of this practice, and to enable our teachers via sharing this multiplicity, acknowledging this multiplicity of perspectives, to get the full potential of translanguaging to find their own voices and empower their learners to find their voices in this multiplicity.
I think it might be useful to show some of the examples that we use in our materials. What do you reckon?
That'd be great, yes, because also some of our participants, Gifty, I think, mentioned they are doing action research. So in Ghana, they used some engaging, so they used some comprehension passages in local language, which makes reading more engaging, meaningful. So it would be great to see some examples from your context as well. So let's continue, and we would like to encourage our participants to keep writing their questions. And yes, there is one more question before we move on.
Yeah.
So many comments and questions, so we would like to cover these as we go along. So Teshome asks, what mechanisms should non-native English teachers do to decolonize and come out of threats of language imperialism? So maybe you will cover it later on, or if you would like to comment on it.
Yeah. I think it is really about starting on the ground, and I would encourage all teachers of English to look at what kind of Englishes are used in the communities, in the general daily use of the students, and what is actually of use to them. So a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach to asking the question, what English is useful for my learners, as opposed to adhering to some kind of standards which are imposed and perhaps ultimately not very useful for them either.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, we look forward to hearing your presentation, more from your presentation.
Yeah, so we now have a poll where we are encouraging you to basically have a reflection. So Tetyana painted the picture that we have a potential of 2 levels of linguistic imperialism interacting in Ukraine. I would like to say this is not unusual globally. This happens quite a lot. It's unusual for Europe. That's what it is. Well, thank you very much for the comments. And this is a very interesting observation, because we can see that from the participants here, there's almost a 50-50 split between those who believe that English does not pose a threat as a potential linguistic imperialism, and others who believe that it does. And we would very much like to position ourselves in the middle, because we think, yes, it's potentially there, but if we do English in a decolonized way, then we can actually mitigate this threat. Yeah. Thank you for your comments. So we have now really prepared the ground for what we are doing, our project. So I'll just say a couple of words about the project. We are aiming at teachers of English. So these people, our participants, are actually classroom teachers in secondary schools. And what we had as aims was to increase the teachers' evaluation of different forms of English, not just UK or US norms, and understand that all languages are constantly changing and subject to fluctuation and not necessarily bound by a fixed standard. And we also wanted to the teachers to value multilingualism and the multilingual skills that the students have amongst them. And we also wanted to know how the teachers place the value of fostering Ukrainian. Ukrainian is obviously #1 language in Ukraine, but it is lacking development still as a fully fledged academic language by some of the speakers, not overall. And very important for us, we wanted them to feel more comfortable in their English, whatever level of English and whatever variety of English they spoke. We wanted to increase their sense of confidence and self-efficacy in this. We did this via a session which was basically synchronous, like Zoom we are in now, 4 sessions with the 4 different topics that you can see. And before the sessions, we asked all of the participants and a control group, so some teachers who were not participating, to fill in a questionnaire. And we also had quite a lot of discussions in different focus groups with the same participants. So we have qualitative and quantitative data. We have now finished the delivery of these focus groups. Very important for us, and more important as we went along, was the facility to communicate with our participants outside the Zoom meetings. And we had 2 forms there. We have a discussion forum on our website, and we have something called Padlet, where the participants could just post any of the thoughts on the materials. And we are now in the process of gathering the data for the post-intervention. So after this teaching, we are asking similar questions again to see whether anything has changed. Okay, and now I'm handing over to Tetyana, who will give you a little bit of a flavor of the kind of materials we had.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Now I have this chance to give you more specific examples of how actually we did it. So for our session 1, we outlined the following priorities, the following foresight that we would like to focus upon. And we wanted to raise the awareness of our teachers that the concept of colonialism applies not only to the Russian language, but we should critically approach the English colonial past and potential colonizing pedagogy. We would also like to dethrone the native speaker and to give the Ukrainian teachers who are non-native teachers of English the power to acknowledge their potential and their advantages, to discuss the global English, and to focus on the fact that the English is overwhelmingly used between different speakers for whom English not the native language, and the speakers have very different L1s, the first languages. And compare also English with other lingua francas historically to see some patterns, how lingua francas work and what it means for education. So an example, this is an activity that we offered during our live session. We focused on the book industry in languages, publications in English and in other languages. And we wanted to raise awareness to other world languages, and in particular to demonstrate the strong link between economic wealth and the publication and the language communication. So this is kind of activity. Now you can imagine you are in one of our live Zoom sessions. So have a rough guess what percentage of all books in the world are published in English each year. You have a second to think for yourself. And this is what we showed our participants, and I can show you now. This is what actually happens. And as you can see, if you look at Chinese, for example, we think how many Chinese speakers are all over the world, but only 13.3% of all books are published in Chinese. On the other hand, we know that there are not that many German or French or Japanese speakers in comparison with Chinese or English. However, these countries having strong economy and having high levels of education, they can boast, have, as you can see, very good publication rates of books. For our second session, we focused on global varieties of English, and we provided the arguments how we can develop the materials, teaching and learning materials for our students to make the students aware of the varieties of English. And this is one of the tasks. Again, you can imagine being in our Zoom session. This is a picture you can see, and this picture represents this creature which has this name starting with M. Yeah, and the question is, what could the phrase "he did a Merlin" or Merlion mean? If you could hear that, well, you might very well know, because it might actually represent your variety of English. But if you didn't know yet, and if you made a guess, and if you guess that that phrase means to vomit, you are absolutely right, because this is what this phrase means. Yeah, and this is what is clear to people who speak Singaporean English, but for people who speak English as the first language, yeah, who acquire the English as a foreign language, this meaning is not necessarily available firsthand. For session 3, we focused on the complex relationships between language and culture, and we provided arguments and materials to use intercultural approach and how to introduce interculturality into the classroom. Ursula has mentioned Claire Cramsch today, and we basically dwell very much upon Cramsch's ideas of interculturality and how to teach culture through comparison and through reflection on one's own culture. This is just a snapshot of the activities that we offered. We suggested our participants to get to look at this video on the British Council website actually before our session, and the video is devoted to celebrating Christmas. Christmas is also important in Ukraine, and you can see some of the details here, these little snapshots, the Christmas postcards, and the Christmas tree, and the whole lesson can be centered upon comparison and reflection whether sending and writing Christmas postcards is an important part of culture in Ukraine now, whether it was an important part in Ukraine before, because there have been some changes. And in terms of the Christmas tree, what kind of decorations, who decorates, when, how long the Christmas tree is expected to stay in the home, and interestingly, where to place it, close to the window that other people can see it from the outside, or then further back to the house, somewhere to the center of the home. And this something probably it can be an answer to one of the questions which have been asked today, how we bring different cultures. Yeah, but each culture is a difference. And for example, this is video also prepared, which develops upon the resources prepared from the British Council. We asked our participants to watch this video before, and we had very lively feedback on our Padlet and discussion forum on our website when our participants actually suggested how they can use this video to teach the cultural diversity of the speakers of English, for what lessons, in what way, what kind of activities they can link to this video to help their learners understand it. And yeah, I think this is time for our third poll. And in our third poll, we ask the question, what do you think? Decolonized ways of teaching English will catch on or will be very hard to implement, and people will still prefer teaching standard English, either UK or US?
So hello again. Tetyana and Ursula, while our participants are voting, I'd like to share a number of questions shared in the chat in the Q&A.
Yeah.
So first of all, some comments, very helpful comments, like Roberta mentions in their EFL classes. So in my EFL classes, I try to insert English as a lingua franca, presenting other varieties of English. Doing this, I try to develop my students' intercultural awareness, critical thinking, and empower them to use the language. And Jafet mentioned this is a critical and timely topic that challenges us to rethink traditional pedagogies and move towards more inclusive practices. Heba also mentions, thank you for this great topic. My question addresses the dilemma of how can we keep the distinctive barrier between English and various Englishes produced. So do you think that resembles a difficulty in communication, for example? This was a question.
Yeah, great question. Thank you very much. So first of all, a huge congratulations to any of you teachers who are using varieties of English which are not native speakers, but actually taking those varieties from how English is globally used today as an international lingua franca. All of these forms can be described as decolonized ways of teaching English, definitely. And I should think it's not just ticking one box. It's, as we said at the beginning, it's ticking a variety of boxes together to achieve full decolonized teaching of English. But every single bit that you can do, showing how English works and how it functions to help us as global citizens to communicate with other people using a huge variety of first languages. That is the aim today of the vast majority of English teaching, absolutely. And there was one question at the very end about the feasibility. Was it the feasibility? I can't remember what the topic was. The question that Siren said at the very beginning.
The question about one of those questions I mentioned? Or...
Yes. but I think it related to our polling question, and then maybe we can combine those, because we've seen the answers now, and thank you for your responses. And I think that your responses were basically really sitting on this cusp of being very critical towards a decolonizing approach, and understanding the difficulties around it. That really sums up quite well where we are now today. And I think a lot of the problems relate to what I would call a legacy of whole systems of teaching English, including assessment systems, including materials, including entire education systems. So moving towards a decolonized way of teaching English is by no means a fast process. It's going to take time, and it's going to take quite a number of different stakeholders to work together towards it altogether. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's difficult.
Yes, Jakob also mentioned, can we think about decolonizing English without thinking about larger political economic transformation, and what impact does high stakes English testing, if any, have on attempts to decolonize English teaching Ukraine?
Yeah.
So I have also.
Yeah, I think the political context is definitely important, but as we look and as David Goddard has done, as we look at basically where economic growth happens and where population growth happens globally as well, we are noticing that those countries where English is spoken as the first language, relative to other countries where population growth is faster, and therefore more speakers of these languages are basically growing up, and they are experiencing also a faster acceleration of economic growth. For instance, the BRIC countries, we are noticing a gradual power shift as well. And that gradual power shift is going to not be the only element, but it's going to be one of the elements that can help us towards a decolonization. Increasingly, those people who want to use English as a lingua franca may legitimately ask themselves, as a nation, as an education system, what is good for us? It is not necessarily good for us to be able to speak British English and the King's English, and change their systems accordingly. This is not going to happen overnight, of course.
Yeah, definitely. So many brilliant questions. So one of them is, what would be the benefit for the student of a decolonized English learner when being interviewed in a multinational company and being rejected because of lacking proper English accents?
Yes, yes. Well, I think that there is a danger that this might happen. I'm not saying it will not happen, but communicative competency in a foreign language is more than accuracy. One of the key things, especially in international communication with a huge number of strangers where you really don't know which context they come from, and a job interview where you're sitting in an interview with, a large corporation, and the people interviewing you might have all sorts of backgrounds. It's a really good example. You need to show cultural sensitivity. You need to show awareness that what you may say in a British context as a side remark or as a joke may actually sound offensive in a different culture. And you need to show awareness of the varieties of pronunciations, and that, for instance, using metaphors, using idiomatic expressions, using cultural references to your own cultural institutions may be completely misunderstood by some of the people that you're talking to. So we know that communicative competence is much, much more than accuracy. And if this company that is, given as an example, wants somebody who is a good communicator, they would be looking for more than just grammatical accuracy. And teaching a decolonized way is looking beyond that accuracy. It's looking at mutual intelligibility, cultural sensitivity, all of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this also mentioned is scaffolding in of the questions. So we should try to aim to balance this scaffolding with linguistic varieties and flexibility. Another question. So actually, yes, and the Andy asked a question. Just let me find it. Yes, one of the challenges of in-service teacher training towards a decolonized approach, in my experience as teachers of English who themselves have been through a traditional approach and feel that it's the right way. That's yeah, one of them.
Yes.
You would like
So
maybe.
this is what we call the inertia of systems, right? Educational systems where teachers first go through schoolings and through university, and if they think they're that lucky, they get sent to the UK to university for 1 year, come back with British, receive pronunciation, and therefore we are basically part of a system. And what we see here, and the reason why we're targeting teachers, is that we want to approach a new approach at all of the different elements in the teaching. So it's teacher training, and also the next thing we want to do is to develop this for teacher trainers. So not just teachers, but teacher trainers, and then teaching materials themselves. We are very fortunate in one way. English, because it's so commonly taught, is a language that has a huge variety of teaching materials, decolonized teaching materials available for free on the internet. So in that sense, we are quite resource rich. We're not necessarily rich in the variety of assessment materials, but it's certainly one of the elements where we can actually try to increase change.
Yes, you are right. So Teshome also mentioned the influence of digital technology. So this is one of the advantages for us to access. One other question, big question from Gifty. Gifty asks, are teachers and school authorities willing to decolonize English teaching? How can we handle such situations in our countries as your policy?
Yes. So if I understood that question correctly, it is a question of trying to influence change at the policy level, at the higher up level. So that there would be more of a sort of bottom-up movement from, for instance, from teachers, from teacher educators, to try and influence curriculum change and a change in what is actually needed, kind of by assessment. So in my experience, it works best by trying to talk to the people, the key stakeholders who are in the position of making these changes on the top-down level. So key educators, policy developers, and politicians, by convincing them of the social and political and economic needs of this change. And I think we've made this the case really for the economic, political, and social needs to move towards this, because we want to equip our students in the classroom with skills that they really need later on in life.
So many useful learning points from you. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's move on, because I know you also have a lot to talk.
Well, we're nearly finished. Because we are now at the position of having finished our delivery of the teaching, we can say a little bit about it as well. So we were teaching towards people that are teaching English in the context of a war, tremendously challenging. And the enemy targeted the electricity supply systems, and a lot of the teachers, a lot of the towns and villages had either no electricity at some stages or very intermittent, unreliable electricity. Very difficult. At the same time, we noticed that teachers appreciated this, because in this context, we offered a little bit of normality. We offered a little bit of something they looked forward to. Discussion points about things that they appreciated and that they value. So it was a positive moment in their lives. But because of the problems of accessing Zoom, we scaled down the time. So from 2 hours, we went to less than 1 hour, and we increased the asynchronous contact. So we have a Padlet where they could write their comments at any time, and we have a discussion forum. And the participants really liked it. They really participated freely, and we had a lot of comments. In fact, so much it will take us quite some time to evaluate all of the comments. So these asynchronous participation forms are vital, I would say. And we also needed to think about those that didn't make it to the Zoom sessions. So part of the Ukrainian system is that teacher training is necessary, is compulsory every 5 years, and our seminars were one way for those teachers to get a teacher training certificate, basically valorized by the British Council as well. It's not therefore that they live in a war. It's not therefore they have no electricity. We wanted them to have an opportunity to participate and get a certificate without attending Zoom. So if they send us reflection pieces on the material, so the materials are there, the recorded sessions are there, and they can read. So whenever they've got a little bit of electricity, they can engage, and they can send in reflection pieces on the 4 sessions, and then they still get the certificates. The gender issue, we were targeting female teachers. On the whole, the population of teachers of languages in Ukraine are female, but we wanted to also safeguard those female teachers in case a male teacher came. We didn't necessarily want them in the Zoom session because we were not entirely sure whether these male teachers had subscribed to become teachers in order to avoid being sent to the front. We didn't want to make a judgment call about this, but we are aware that amongst the teachers, that female teachers that were sitting there, there would be quite a few who'd lost a husband, who'd lost a brother or a son or whatever in the war, and there were potentials for tension. So we didn't want that, and we didn't have participants who were male in our Zoom sessions for that reason. What we want to do next is to evaluate all of the post comments after our sessions as well, and disseminate our training materials to teacher trainers. So we've applied for some funding at the University of York to basically continue this with teachers, trainers of teachers in Ukraine. We are holding a conference at the University of York on the 8th of May. The conference is free to attend, so anybody who wants to come, you're very welcome. We're going to write a report for the British Council, a publication in a journal as well, and we have written to the Ministry of Education in Ukraine to offer these materials for free as well, if they so wanted to. We know from the responses when we had the focus groups and all of the Padlet comments that there was a lot of reflection amongst the teachers, and a lot of them said, oh, we didn't see the link between the colonialism, the imperialist Russian aspect and the potential imperialist English contact. We didn't see the link at all. So that was very good to know. But ultimately, we're still doing our analysis now as to how much we have changed people's attitudes. And we want to disseminate our materials further if we can. Ultimately, we understand the systemic hindrances are things like the assessments are what they are, and the current teaching materials are what they are as well. And ultimately, we would like to reach more teachers. So that comes now to the end with perfect timing. Thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have some more questions and comments. So Aisha mentions it's hard to imagine that decolonizing English will catch on, especially since not many teachers are aware of the concept in the first place. So as you are going to share some training materials, your research, and you have also shared some reading, pre-webinar reading, which our participants can find on our webinar page. So you can check also references. And, Yasin asked, how can teachers balance the need for standard English in international communication while promoting local varieties of English? You know, you have mentioned briefly, but Could you tell us more about it with some maybe practical strategies for our teachers, teacher educators in this session?
Yeah. Oh, I think this is ultimately a really, really difficult question, and I do not have the sort of the one fits all answer to that. But I think one important thing that I always like to teach all of my students who are very international is when we're thinking about standard English, so standard British or standard American English, this is not one variety either. It's a whole lot of different varieties. And I often start my lessons with making our students aware that being a native speaker of English doesn't mean at all that you're a good communicator. In fact, I have dozens of examples of English native speakers being not very good at all at communicating in the first place, and being particularly bad at communicating with an international audience, because they have not learned how to accommodate. If you are learning a foreign language, learning how to accommodate is one of the skills that you acquire. So I think the tension that is described there is a tension between, on the one hand, some awareness of standards, but also dethroning this very idea of standard. There's no such thing as the one standard only.
Definitely. Huma also mentioned another problem. The other problem is most popular coursebook and resources have been written with an English-only philosophy, leaving teachers without guidance and tools needed to effectively integrate other languages. So in that case, what would you suggest to our
Yeah. I'm a great fan of the European Center for Modern Languages, ECML. They are funded by the European Union, and if you Google ECML, they sit in Austria, in the beautiful city of Graz. The ECML specializes in fostering multilingual approaches to language teaching, very often including English. They have a huge host of teaching materials which are very underutilized because they're not very well known, but the materials are excellent, and they are free. It's one of the beautiful things about the English language. When you want to teach it in a different way, you are very likely to find some materials that are free on the internet somewhere.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing this resource. So yeah, it would be good to maybe find it, quickly share it in the chat. So one other question, Nasreen asks, do you agree that one of the preparing teachers, one way of preparing teachers to adopt decolonized teaching methods is to include courses about the influence of cultural differences on language teaching in pre-service preparation programs? I mean, teaching them the theory and practice of decolonizing through historical and cultural lens. Are there any programs that you have seen?
Yes. So you can, this whole approach of teaching language and culture, you can approach it pedagogically in a number of different ways. So one of the ways is teaching intercultural communicative competence, which is nowadays seen as a freestanding separate competence, and there are well-known modules and teaching programs and books on teaching intercultural communicative competence. Mike Byram is the key name there. And another approach which I personally favor, especially for school teaching, secondary school teaching context, is more embedded. An embedded approach whereby when you're teaching your target language, you are also teaching intercultural awareness. The Claire Kampsch approach to teaching culture in the language classroom. So rather than have it, for instance, as a pre-service freestanding program, teaching it interspersed throughout your entire teaching would be, I think, appropriate. But when you're asking me, when you're becoming a teacher, so as a teacher training, is it better to have it as a pre-service freestanding module or embedded? I think it depends what kind of variety of teachers or teacher trainees you have when they first come. really. But for a school context, I would advocate an embedded approach in the way that we've demonstrated it.
Yeah, that's practical also, lends this cultural, intercultural, communicative competence. So many resources by the European Commission, Union, as you also mentioned, from GRAS. So thank you so much. So it's been another eye-opening session for us. So we have also received very thought-provoking questions from our audience as well. So thank you, our participants, for your active participation and involvement. We hope that you have gained some practical and awareness-raising insights from our experience, from this experience in our webinar. So we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we also have some background reading on our webinar page to our presenters' research in this area. So we are going to follow up with you, hopefully in the future once you publish your research. And thank you for your comments and questions. Our next session will be in February. So please check out our website for the next webinar in February. And remember to sign up our newsletter for any updates on our next webinars. So next webinar will be on 18th of February. And you will also receive a link to a feedback survey through which you will be able to download your certificate. And this session recording will also be available on our Teaching English website in the next couple of days. So thank you so much once again, Ursula and Tetyana. It's been a great session, and we look forward to seeing you again on our webinar program.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.